Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Greetings and salutations. How are we doing? All right. There we go. There we go. I am Randy Winston, Director of Writing Programs here at the Center for Fiction. Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Wednesday evening. The Center for Fiction, for those of you who do not know, is the only literary nonprofit organization here in the United States that solely focuses on the celebration of fiction in all of its forms. We do this through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, our first novel prize, our writer studio, and our emerging writer fellowship. You can follow us on social media and sign up for our mailing list, meaning you don't miss future events like this one. A few housekeeping announcements. Our cafe and bar will be open until 8:30, which is a blessing for all of us. We will have an audience Q&A. When it is time to go to questions, if you are here in the audience, please raise your hand and wait for one of our interns to bring a microphone to you so that our guests on the live stream, as well as folks here, can hear your question. If you are watching via the live stream, you may type your questions into the chat at any time. Let's get started. Lisa Gornick is the author of four books, most recently The Peacock Feast and Louisa Meets Bear, both published by FSG and Picador. Her essays have appeared widely, including in the New York Times, the Paris Review, Real Simple, and the Wall Street Journal. A graduate of the Yale Clinical Psychology Program and the Psychoanalytic Training Program at Columbia, where she is on the faculty, she has for many years practicing psychotherapist, has been a practicing psychotherapist and psychoanalyst. She lives in New York City with her family. You can learn more about Lisa and her work at lisagornickauthor.com. The moderator for tonight's conversation will be Joan Silber. Joan is the author of 9 books of fiction. Her most recent and Secrets of Happiness, listed as an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review and one of the most anticipated books of the year by BuzzFeed, The Millions, and Lit Hub. Her novel Improvement won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the PEN Faulkner Award, and she received the PEN Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story. Her book, Fools, was longlisted for the National Book Award and a finalist for the PEN Faulkner Award. The Size of the World was a finalist for the New York Times Fiction Prize, and Ideas of Heaven was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Story Prize. She's also the author of Art of Time and Fiction. She lives in New York as well and taught for many years at Sarah Lawrence College and in the Warren Wilson MFA program. Y'all are in for a treat. Without further ado, we would like to start with a reading. And with that, Lisa, will you read for us, please?
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Center for Fiction, for hosting Joan and me, and family and friends and book lovers. Thank you for showing up on a Wednesday night. I very much appreciate it. Let me tell you just a little bit about the book before I do a short reading. Anna Turns unspools over the 24 hours of a woman's 60th birthday as she wends her way through Manhattan. Yoga class with her quarreling nieces, the Met with her transitioning adult child, the Harlem brownstone of her gonzo journalist lover, Central Park with her pot-addicted doctor husband, dinner at a pseudo-louche venue arranged by her self-made brother. Told in alternating chapters by Anna and other people important to her, we learn about her past and present dilemmas from her point of view, and then enlarged by the overlay of their stories, some known to her, some not. So I'm going to read first the opening few pages, which take place at midnight in Anna's study, and then jump ahead to midday in the lobby of the Met. The second hand on the Museum of Modern Art desk clock arrives at the 12 to align with the minute and hour arrows so that for an instant the three form a vector pointed heavenward, shepherding in my 60th birthday. The clock was a rare gift from my father, Rolf, dead this past year, who never remembered my birthday. My mother, Jean, never forgets. Of late, she's memorialized the day with an email sent at midnight. More cyber attack, italicized and bolded fonts, hyperlinks, capitalized text than Hallmark sentiment. Now, my mother's latest birthday email sits atop my inbox with calculations as the subject. Can I delete it unopened? For God's sake, I'm 60 years old. Am I not the sentry of my own mind? I open it. Anna, colon. On your 60th birthday, it seems appropriate to share the following, all caps, calculations that I made 20 years ago regarding the inflation-adjusted sum of money I spent on you. 1, people never realize how, all caps, very costly it is to raise a child. 2, if this information were more widely available, the birth rate would undoubtedly be lower and our economy more prosperous. 3, I plan to write a letter to the New York Times on this subject. 4, 20 years ago, the number I calculated for the amount I spent raising you was $56,000. Had I invested that money starting at your birth rather than spending it year by year on you, it would have grown with compound interest to nearly, all caps, $250,000. All of which is to say, being a parent is a great sacrifice. Mom/Jean. I bury my head in my arms, the words detonating, my adult self imploding. No, I tell myself. No, no, and no. I'm seated on the lobby's circular bench, absorbed in Clarissa Dalloway's response to Lady Bruton having invited Clarissa's husband, but not her, to luncheon, when Simon kisses my cheek. Happy birthday, Mom. The changes in Simon from the feminizing therapy have been gradual, but slowly a ravine has widened between the person who announced last October they know in their soul they're a woman and a graceful creature standing in front of me in a turtleneck sweater with brows that look like they've been plucked and a chin with no sign of stubble. By the end of summer, they've told me they'll change their name to Simona and begin using female pronouns. With this news have come new worries. Will Simona be safe? What if she's in an accident and the ambulance crew cut off her clothes and discover she's trans? What if one of them is transphobic? Will they still help her? Simon takes my arm as I stand. Sorry I'm late. Inga forgot I was taking you to lunch and scheduled a meeting with the series editor. They roll their eyes. I had to attend. While we walk through the Greek and Roman galleries to the restaurant, Simon tells me Inga now wants to incorporate debates about consciousness into her book on legal questions raised by reproductive technologies. I listen, letting my eyes wander over the marble statues, for centuries considered the embodiment of an Aryan ideal when, in fact, they'd originally been painted in a range of skin tones. Never before have I noticed the sheer quantity of male genitals in the galleries, depicted so sweetly and flower-like, smelling of stone, not man. I inhale deeply. We can only be as happy as our least happy child, Fiona is fond of saying. For both of us, our least happy child is our only child. With Simon, though, the saying isn't apt. Since declaring their intention to transition, Simon is not unhappy. Like Clarissa Dalloway's daughter who sees the horizon as infinite, she might be a doctor, a farmer, go into parliament, or she might be indolent and do none of the above. My child is excited about the changes ahead. Simon pauses at a terracotta statue of a woman seated on a boulder. Belief, they've explained, has nothing to do with their experience. They don't believe they're a woman, they are a woman. What's most challenging for me is what I know in my bones. I must not turn a deaf ear to the essential difference between believe, which presumes other possibilities, and is or are, with their full transitive equal sign, non-disputable force. I must not say anything that implies I understand who you are more than you do yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you guys all for coming. This is great tonight. Great to see everybody. This is on, right? You're all hearing me clearly? Good. So I'm going to, ask Lisa a series of questions, and at the very end, there will be room for you guys to ask a few things. So I love that you began with that. That just was wonderful. Covered, crucial things so easily. So I'm going to ask you the most obvious question, which is, how did you first get the idea to write this book? Where did it start from, and how did it change as you worked on it?
Okay. Well, first, hi, everyone. Now I can see you. And, I really can't remember, to be honest. And I think that, like a lot of fiction writers, I start with a glimpse of a character, and slowly they start to flesh out, and other characters appear. And then I begin to have some jot notes, have ideas of things that happen to them. And that's how the story builds, sort of it accretes like sand, like a sand castle. So do you, Joan, do you feel like you start with a coherent idea of where?
Oh, absolutely. Coherence is never my strong point. But I have an idea as well as a character usually. But sometimes that idea changes. It's harder and easier in some books. But I never know the real form of it until it's done,
Right.
So it takes place on Anna's 60th birthday. She's sort of taking account of everything, and everything changes sort of as she does it. It's a time of reckoning for her. I guess that's the word for it. So I love the note from her impossible mother about, let's just take account of everything you cost me. It's your birthday, but we have to tell you how much I paid for everything. And the mother's going to be at her birthday dinner, which we eventually get to attend. And then she has a somewhat impossible older brother. And they're both very much in her life. I was struck by that as I was reading. I mean, it's not an easy family, but she has not chosen to slip away from them. And they're the first things we learn about here as we read the book. Can you talk about how the family figures shape her story and what the process of inventing them was like? Particularly the mother, who I think is just wild as a character.
Thank you. Well, it's, this book was a long, long time in the making, so I'm going to answer kind of tangentially. The original form of the book was told in only Anna's voice. Mm-hmm. So I had Anna's story, and I had all of these other characters, but they were from her point of view. They were depicted, of course, as the author. I had a little bit of a larger view of them. And then I began to write stories about the other characters, including some that are not in this book. And eventually I realized that I wanted to fold these two books together. And so at that point, then I had to decide which of these characters were going to end up in this book. And what I discovered was that in writing the stories from her father's point of view, from her brother, her lover, her lover's wife, and her husband's point of view, I had to inhabit their consciousness. And I don't know if this happens to you, but when you're writing about someone for a long time and you're going deeply into their mind, you can't help but begin to see the world and see through their eyes and to feel some compassion and empathy. So I think that enabled me to see sort of where Anna had to go in order to be able to understand her family of origin, to let go of a lot of ossified ideas she had about them. So that's how the book came together. It wasn't until pretty recently that I realized that the title itself, Anna Turns, embodies a lot of those ideas. That first, just concretely, Anna is turning away from many things, and that she's turning back to certain things, and she's also turning towards certain things. But that by the structure, by having the reader move from Anna's point of view into others' point of view, the reader also has to turn from seeing the world through Anna's eyes to seeing the world in other eyes. And there are a lot of stories in the book. The book is sort of stories embedded in stories that Anna doesn't know herself. I mean, she has picked them up like a sponge, the emotional tenor of them, but she doesn't concretely know many of these stories herself. But so the reader is following along. I think originally they may have unsympathetic views to some of the characters, but once you read them through their own stories, hopefully one has a larger view and more compassionate view of them.
Oh, absolutely. For me, at any rate, it totally changed or gradually changed as I was reading the book. Made a big difference. Virginia Woolf's wonderful novel, Mrs. Dalloway, is mentioned in Anna's thoughts. She's thinking about it, getting ready for the party, as Mrs. Dalloway is. And then some of the advanced reviews have compared the book to Mrs. Dalloway. So I wanted to know what your sense is of how the books connect.
Well, I love Mrs. Dalloway. It's really one of my favorite novels, and I've read it many, many times. And I don't think they connect in the sense that I wasn't trying to rewrite Mrs. Dalloway. I would never have the audacity to try to do that. But I certainly loved what she does of depicting an entire life in one day, so that by the time we leave Mrs. Dalloway, we really know Clarissa's story. And not only has she depicting Clarissa's life, but she's also depicting the whole environment of London at that time. I think it's supposed to be 1919, I believe. It's right after World War I. And so we see through Septimus Smith what's going on. And I also wanted in Anna Turns to not have this be solely a family story, because I just don't think that any of us are insulated from what's going on in the world around us. So Anna is aware of what's going on. It's set in 2017, April, which is a time when we were all kind of shell-shocked.
Yes, yes, that's right. Our little spot in history, yeah.
Right.
Yes. In addition to being about family, this is a novel about sex and love, and it's also how history is brought into it, actually, through her lover. Anna loves her husband, but they have not had sex for 9 years because he has a painful ailment, which he's been treating through vaping marijuana, and that's sort of kept him from everything else. She still loves her husband. I think it's a very complicated, I'm sort of simplifying it and telling it, but it's a very complicated treatment of a real relationship. But during this time, for 7 years, she's had a lover whom she also loves and who's also married. And both men are presented as very appealing, which I think is quite an interesting way of doing it. Neither is the villain of the piece. I'm going to ask you a little bit. The lover is a journalist, so he brings in history. I'm going to ask about that in a second. But I wanted to ask first about, when we begin the book, it's about family, and then it opens out to being very much about sexual love in her life. Can you talk about the role of romantic love in the novel, the somewhat unusual ways the book presents it and considers it? Can you just say a few things to us about that?
Okay, let me think about that for a minute. Well, the first thought that comes to mind, Joan, is the scene in which Anna meets her husband, Henry. So she's a graduate student at Penn studying English and feeling pretty much out of place. She's come from a scrappy background. She doesn't have an Ivy League education. She's gone to community college and sort of made her way into graduate school. And she's at this party and she's feeling incredibly uncomfortable. She doesn't drink beer, and all they're serving is beer. And this very warm man comes up to her and he says something like, "I can see you're not a beer drinker." And it turns out that the party is at his house. She's come along with her friend, who's an ex of his roommate. And he says, "Would you like some orange juice?" And the orange juice he makes from this bag of oranges that his mother has sent him from Florida. And she's in Boca Raton, and he's grown up, in Great Neck, and in this very warm, loving family. She can imagine the smells in the house of the things that his mother has cooked, whereas she has grown up with her grandparents who run a bakery, and dinner is pretty much the leftover bread from the bakery. And so he's very appealing to her. But the other thing that he does that's incredibly appealing to her is he says, "Tell me about yourself." And he really wants to get to know her. And he does really get to know her, and they have a very loving marriage, and they have a child together. And then he has this back injury, which he manages by, he's a doctor, he's an anesthesiologist, and he doesn't want to completely give up his work, but he knows he's going to go down a really bad path if he keeps using the opiates he's prescribed. So he starts to treat it himself by vaping marijuana, and their sex life goes by the wayside with the back injury and the vaping. So she's not a person who ever really intended to have an affair. She loves art, and she goes to museums very frequently by herself. And she's downtown at the Rubin Museum looking at the Near Eastern art, and she meets this man, and she gets pulled into it, and she feels a great deal of guilt about it. But he recognizes something in her that has sort of gone into cold freeze. And he also sees some things in her that she hasn't known about herself, and that is very appealing, which is she's never thought about herself as having an aesthetic side. And he sees that in her, in the way that she moves and dresses and what she's able to observe. And his version of sex, he has also a strong marriage. He's married to a pediatrician, and he talks a lot about the difference. He says for him, sex is like surfing. He's a surfer. And it's a creative space for him, and it's one in which he feels like he's able to intuit and get in touch. It's a kind of meditative and larger and spiritual experience. For his wife, Alice, and we have a chapter in her point of view, he says it's another pleasure, like chocolate, like eating chocolate or having or bathing in the sun. It doesn't have the same meaning for her. And it's the first time that Anna has experienced this with anyone. And it's very compelling. She feels very, very guilt-ridden. Now, what's complicated in the book is that, I guess in this setting, there's no reason to not have spoilers. Her husband knows. He figures it out pretty early on. And he thinks that she does, it's very confused between them. But he thinks that she doesn't want him to tell her that he knows, but he does, because he discovers a book that her lover has written that's in her study, and there's an inscription in it that gives that away. So there's a lot of secrets that are going on. And
one of the things that I love is that the lover, whom I sort of have a crush on from reading about him, is what we used to call a gonzo journalist. He has been all over the world, taking rough assignments and so forth, and he has a connection to to Bamayan in Afghanistan, where the Buddhas were destroyed. The cliff. The big statues of Buddha on the cliff were destroyed. And he I really think this, not only does this place us in history, but it also unites us to one of the themes of the book, because he can present, and he's not in favor of what was done, he's horrified, but he sort of explains reasons how it came to happen. And that's, I feel that's part of what the book does in certain ways, that the same way unsympathetic characters become comprehensible to us, if not always admirable, the journalist is in the business of explaining why horrendous things happen. So he's a fabulous character, I think, both for the mechanics of the plot and also some of the themes that, are important in it. So no wonder I like him so much.
Well, and I'll just interject there that the reason that she first goes back to Lance's apartment with him is they're having a tea in the cafe at the Rubin Museum, and he wants to try to explain to her the point of view of Mullah Muhammad Omar, who's the man, the Taliban leader, who has ordered the dynamiting of these Buddhas. And he says, I really need to show you this video for you to understand it. And he wants to show her this clipping, which is an interview with this Taliban leader in which he talks about why he made this decision. And he is looking, Lance, to see whether or not Anna is able to distinguish between Lance is trying to understand the reasoning, and that doesn't mean he's endorsing it. So basically the reasoning for the bombing of the Buddhas, according to this interview in Reddit, is that at the time, there were a lot of international agencies that wanted to come in and restore these Buddhas, which were already pretty damaged even before he dynamited them. And he felt outraged that these international aid agencies would come in and want to restore these Buddhas, which had really no meaning to the local people. The local people were not Buddhist. These were relics from the 6th century. And he wanted them to give money for food instead, and they wanted to restore the Buddhas. And so this was the reason that he dynamites them. Now, as Lance says, it didn't put a grain of rice in anybody's mouth doing this. So it was not an act that created any benefit for any of the local people, but that was the reasoning behind it. And so what Lance is trying to understand is whether Anna has the bent of mind in which she can hold in mind this complexity, that there could be a reason behind an act that at the same time seems abhorrent. And
since I brought up sex, I think the other thing I want to talk about is her son, who is he was born her son, and he is transitioning to being her daughter.
Right.
And she is sort of dealing with all that. Why did you choose to put that in the story? What's its role in the story, do you think?
I'm not sure if I exactly chose it.
It chose you?
Well, I mean, I don't like to use that. I don't like the idea that things choose you, but I think there is like an unconscious logic for me when I'm writing. There's an unconscious logic with which things appear, and then later I begin to hopefully unpack what that logic was, and if it doesn't work, then get rid of it. And there was plenty that I got rid of in this book, trust me. And but I think the unconscious logic here is that Anna is trying to learn to understand her adult child through her adult child's own eyes. And so I've said this before, that I would never have tried to write from the perspective of a trans person. I just could not do that. But I felt that I absolutely could write from the perspective of someone who has adult children, who all of us who do have to at some point be able to let go and understand that their lives belong to them. Yeah. And this was just an extreme version of this that Anna has to deal with, her own anxieties about the path that her adult child has chosen for themselves. But I did do a lot of reading to feel that I could inhabit this situation. So there are some really wonderful memoirs by trans persons, and particularly by trans women, about what it was like with their families and what the process was like. And there's a novel that I admire and recommend, Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, and she has this phrase, and then I put in the acknowledgments, in which she said, there's this huge range of response. The best that you're going to get are the mistakes of loving parents of trans children. So she's, even the best is filled with mistakes, and Anna is filled with mistakes, as is her husband, Henry.
I think it's so gracefully handled in the
Thank
book,
you.
and of all difficult things to handle, I think it's really beautifully done. One of my favorite lines in the book is Anna describing her often spiteful mother, as we could tell from that birthday message. And Anna says, "My poor mother, she's managed to live all these years without gaining any wisdom." Do you want to comment on this and the role that plays in the book?
Well, in the book, Anna starts off, and I read the section in which what she's struggling with is not so much that she's crushed by her mother, but that she's still crushed by her mother. She's 60 years old, and she's still crushed by her mother, and she has the awareness that the problem is her, not her 88-year-old mother. But through the book, she begins to stop being quite so crushed. And part of that is that she sees her mother a bit more fully. And she begins to realize that although there were many things that her mother didn't provide for her, she never put her in danger. She never put her at risk. And she even has a moment when she realizes that her mother, who left her father when Anna was 5 and went back to live with her own parents, that it was a very brave thing for her to do. And that she actually comes to admire her mother for having the gumption to do this. And at the very end, and I think this often happens in intimate relations, that as Anna softens towards her mother actually softens towards her at the end. And there's a moment where her mother, for the first time, shows a little bit of gentleness to her.
Yeah. And, surprisingly, almost. I mean, I liked that part of it. And there's, independent of the plot about the family, there's a little key incident that I'm sort of dying to ask you about. And we hear about it in retrospect. It's something that Anna just sort of did. She's on a plane when she sees a man across from her taking on a knife. And she's seated next to a small child who's not her child, but who's traveling by herself. And the man sees that he's been seen and makes a gesture indicating he'll hurt the child if she says anything. So she has the impossible task of protecting the plane from this guy with a knife who clearly wants to do something, hijack it, presumably. And she has to protect everyone around her, including the small child, while taking care of him. And she manages. I mean, that was, I would not know how to do that, actually, I have to say. She's really great in that. And I wondered, how did this sneak into this plot? What does it have to do with it? It's such a fabulous scene, and it felt right to me, but I didn't know why.
Well, let me think. So Anna has these 2 strains in her, and they are reflected in her education. So she started out in a PhD program in English at Penn because she loves literature, and she loves books, and she loves the imagination. And at some point, she realizes, though, she's really not cut out to be an academic. She cannot speak the theoretical jargon. She says she'd rather go before a firing squad than have to explain deconstruction to anybody. And she leaves that, and she ends up going to social work school, and it's a clinical social work school, and that resonates a great deal with her. But because of almost like chance, she's pregnant when she graduates, and so she doesn't go out to get a job, and her friend sends somebody to her and says, well, would you just help her edit her book? So she says, well, I'm not an editor. How am I going to be able to do this? And her friend says, you know everything about literature, and you've just done a social work degree, and you can absolutely do it. And she finds that there's something in her that allows her to enter into the work with this woman whose manuscript she's trying to edit, that she can see the psychological dynamics that are playing out in it, and she can also see it from a literary perspective. So what does that have to do with the scene on the plane? I think she reads the scene, basically. She looks across at this man and she thinks, I think he's psychotic. I mean, she doesn't think that literally, but she wonders if he's hallucinating. There's something about his agitation. The child who she's sitting next to is just a kid who's been put on a plane, and they're in first class. She's been upgraded. This kid has been put into first class. She's just read her a story that the child is carrying in her backpack. It's Peter Pan. So she just has this instinct that she should read the story to this man. And she realizes as she's reading it to him that he may not even be able to read, but just something happens that she's able to kind of calm him down. Mm-hmm. And that's it. So, and it's very iffy. It could absolutely have not worked. She knows that. She knows that she just had great luck that it did work. And so when she gets off the plane, she doesn't want to tell anybody. I mean, she tells her husband, but she never tells Lance, and she's coming from visiting him. She doesn't even tell him about this situation.
I love that scene. It's really just remarkable.
Thank you.
I think. I want to ask you one quick question, and then it's time to throw it out to the group, right? Which is, I hate it when people ask me this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Which is, what feeling you want people to leave the book with? What do you want them to take home from it?
Oh, that's a good question.
You don't have to give a reductive answer. Right?
Well, first of all, I would like people to leave the book thinking that 60 is not the end of life. There's a lot more life going forward from there. I would like people to consider that we can all be enlarged by asking ourselves what it's like from inside the skin of other people. I've been thinking about this, of course, a lot with what's going on in the world right now in the Middle East, and some local things that are going on in my own building. And it occurred to me that there were a couple of things that maybe came out of the book. One is that it might be reasonable to consider that generosity is more important than fairness, because there really is no fairness in life. But we definitely can have more generosity. And I think that one of the things that happens for Anna in this book is that in many situations she could stand on principle, or we can all stand on principle. If everybody stands rigidly on principle, we're not going to really get anywhere. And that what I think she comes to understand in part in this book is that there might be a higher level principle, that everybody's standing on principle, which has to do with finding some kind of peace. And that is, through this day, she looks forward into a future in which she feels more at peace in her life. And she's made some decisions that are let her feel more at peace.
Yeah. We didn't give away everything. There's parts of it. So we want to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. And I think I don't do that. Somebody else gets the questions, right? Is this true? Or do we just, yes. So do people write their questions or do we just move the mic around? Oh, you're going to move the mic. That's it.
Thank you. Hi, Lisa. How are you? My question is, you mentioned at some point that you had started an earlier draft. It was only from Anna's point of view, and this book has multiple points of view. What was it that led you to turn, as it were, to, what was that moment, if you could describe it to us, when you really understood as a writer that this was what you needed?
Well, I was writing this series of stories that were about the characters, and I guess I just wasn't done with them. It was a little bit, I think I had been inspired by Elizabeth Strauss' Anything is Possible, in which after My Name is Lucy Barton, she's obviously not done with those characters, and then the next book are these stories, and I thought, oh, I can do something like that. And then it was our mutual friend Alice Anne, who had read the stories, and she'd read the novel, and she said, I just feel, we were talking about it. It was in that conversation that I realized I could put them together. And that the book, which really meant starting over, and so at that point, when I put them together, I actually ended up with something that was 150 pages longer than where we are. The book went forward in time another 4 years. There were another 2 characters' stories. We had a story by characters that are no longer in the book, and it was too big. I had overshot. So in the end, I ended up coming back to the original structure of one day, but folding in only some of the stories at that point. And as I said to someone the other day, it was a little bit like Stone Soup. I realized that extra 150 pages, the 4 years that it goes forward in time, that I didn't need any of that, but what I needed was what I'd learned about the characters through that. So I hope what was most important, nutritive, from that 150 pages then got folded back in. So there were just lots and lots of iterations. And
thank you for reading and speaking with us. Springboarding off of that last question, I had a early writing teacher who told me, if you're not throwing out 90% of what you write, you're doing it wrong. And just wondered what you thought about that and how that ratio maybe plays out in the work that you did.
Well, I don't think I threw out 90% of it, but I probably threw out 33% of it. And I think that's probably been true for most of my books. About a third of it ends up not being in the book, or I would say getting compressed in a way that it makes it into the book in a more compressed fashion.
It's a terrifying instruction, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I'd like to throw out that writing teacher. No, sorry. And
Hi, you may not recognize me, but you know me from Susan Greenfield from Fordham. I really loved listening about the book, and I really can't wait to read it. I've got 2 questions. You can answer both or neither. One is, how does your experience as a psychoanalyst inform your writing? And the other is about Mrs. Dalloway, because, in Mrs. Dalloway, there's all of that entering other characters' perspective kind of seamlessly. So I'm wondering if that also, I know that wasn't the original plan, and I'm not saying you copied Mrs. Dalloway, nor have I even read the book yet. So, but is that an association you've made along the way in terms of how different perspectives work? But I'm also really interested in the first question.
okay. Well, I'll say something about the second one. In Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf goes in and out of heads in this really astounding way, in that it's almost sentence by sentence sometimes. So I did not do that. I have done that in other books, but not in this book. In this book, it's a close third for each chapter, and I think 6 of them are from Anna's point of view, and then there are 5 from others, but I'm not moving seamlessly in the way that she does so beautifully in that book. My experience as a psychoanalyst, well, I would say that, and there's some analysts here in the room, I would say that the really foundational principles of being an analyst have stuck with me. And when I stopped practicing as an analyst, my own analyst said to me, "You haven't stopped being an analyst, you've just stopped doing clinical work." And so I really am a deep believer in the unconscious, and that is always at play in my novels. It's at play in the way I work, and it's also in play in the way I see stories, that people do things for unconscious reasons that they don't really know, and if they're lucky enough, they begin to have some insight into that. Certainly am a real believer that the past influences the present, and that's a psychoanalytic principle as well. And I think this, I wouldn't say is necessarily psychoanalytic, but it's a clinical piece of knowledge that I came to understand, which is that the original story that people tell about themselves and their lives, and that the therapist forms about the patient, it is always essentially wrong, or it has to be overturned, or it has to be enlarged or turned upside down. And I think that's true too. I didn't quite answer your question about where the book came from, but I did have some original ideas in it, but they didn't become the central ideas. They were replaced, and I think that's the same as you see. So there's, and I guess the other part of it is patience, that patience, that one needs in doing clinical work. And I think that's the same for fiction writing. You need a lot of patience. Hi, Helen.
This is a sort of deeply New York City book. Could you talk about New York City as a character in the book?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. And that people have commented, because London is a character in Mrs. Dalloway, and I do think New York is a character. And in fact, I was at dinner with Margot, who's somewhere here the other day, there she is, and said, "Oh, here's Washington Square Park. This is where Lance meets the Joni Mitchell lookalike girl that he ends up going off to Afghanistan with." And the other day I was walking with another friend, and I said, "Oh, there's the Frederick Douglass statue." That's so. I'm a walker. I walk all over the city. I love the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I spend a huge amount of time there. So many things that are places that are just in my own bones are in this book. I think New York is an amazing city, and one of the things that I love about it is that it changes at a faster pace than I could absorb it. So I feel like I'm never going to get to the bottom of it, and that's a great joy for me.
And we will stop there. Lisa, Joan, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.